My name is William Collins, and I work as a principal cloud architect with Alkira. And today I get to cover a topic that I'm pretty passionate about, automation. So I remember where I was when I wrote my first bash script. It was in my parents' living room when they had a computer that I installed Slackware on, and I think it was Windows 98. So yeah, it was a pain in the neck to get that back, but I became obsessed with Linux at that point, and writing that first bash script was really cool. I put these commands in a file, I ran it, and it did what I told it to do. So ever since then, I've done everything from Perl, Python, Ansible, like all the different tooling, and it's just been a pretty big focus area for me. So we're going to cover how just this next generation platform, which kind of bridges two worlds. So you have the data center networking area. You're thinking routers and switches, lots of different disparate things in the data center. But then you have cloud folks doing like who knows what. They have all these pipelines up. They're just deploying. Like as I've talked in this session, they've deployed something else or released something else. So pretty constant change. A little about Alkira. If you think about imagine a world, in the past where you had, companies had all their intellectual property, all their applications, all the things that are important to them, within the four walls of their data center. That's where everything was. And then something happened, something changed. So imagine the helicopter rolls over and drops napalm on the dam, and the floodgates break, and then you have applications, services, everything, everywhere. You have cloud becomes a thing, Exchange servers move out of on-premises, everything's, going to cloud, and the change is happening quicker. So as that happens, as this change sort of happened, this is where we come in. We create a consistent network across all the things that an enterprise needs to connect with, interface with, and enable a consistent and cohesive policy. But one thing that makes this really awesome is our founders, our product team, our engineering teams, they recognize that this is an API-driven world. If I go into a customer meeting, automation and strategy is like at the top of the list all the time. It's something that, pretty much every mid to, large size enterprise is trying to get right. And it's a challenge. And it's especially a challenge in the traditional networking world where you have so many different interaction surfaces, different vendors, you're dealing with hardware, you just have a lot of touch points. And then there's not a way to like enforce, your operational state versus desired state and reconciling that, with the source of truth conundrum and, just all these different aspects. So we have an API, of course, that is, in parity with everything you can do in the UI. So, all the things you do in the AI or the UI, you can use Python, Golang, whatever your flavor of a general purpose programming language is, and do the same thing with REST. But the thing I'm going to demo is something that's sort of, I know it took my world by storm several years ago. You might have heard of this tool called Terraform, and it's pretty popular, and a lot of folks like to use it. And on top of that, they want to change the delivery mechanism as well. They want to do this infrastructure as code. They want to build pipelines, and they want to like automate this whole process. And it almost takes the place of like traditional ITIL-based change management. So we'll look at this a little further. Now, the first thing I think about just with design, like when I go to the drawing board, I think about like reliability, security, scale, and I think about some of these attributes that you want like in your design holistically. And then I think, okay, like you have to really build a secure foundation. You have to build a good foundation, call it network bedrock, that the things that we connect to later in the demo can come back and connect with and consume. And on top of that, we want to also integrate services that we use in the data center. One of the things is like, if you have an IPAM solution, or if you have if you're using like Palo Alto and you have security engineering team and they put all the time into building these policies and rules, chances are they're going to want to use them at least when you're connecting to cloud. And having that functionality there for them becomes very important. And then we're going to do some segmentation as well. So we're going to do some macro and micro segmentation. And then with, let's call it digital transformation, the first thing that an organization has to do, they got to connect to the cloud in the first place. So they probably have some data centers, they have their sites. So I'm going to connect SD-WAN fabric. We're going to use Cisco SD-WAN. And then in my time working in enterprise, I worked in enterprise for over 15 years. Partners are a huge part of that. So when you're going on this big journey of, changing the things that transcend the technology, even the people, the practices, the teams, you have these challenges, and it helps a lot of times to bring in a partner to get you going, at least in the beginning, in the right direction. So I'm going to connect a few partners, and then from here, and in this whole aspect of the demo, so I'm going to do this with Terraform. I'm going to do it locally, like on my machine. Call that the beginning stages, the Wild West stages of your infrastructure as code journey. But as we get more mature, you're going to want to use, DevOps came and really just, I'd say, flip the table on the way that most everybody does everything. It changes practices, changes delivery, changes even, breaking down those silos. Like networking and security was a big one for me for a long time. Like, network folks want things to talk. They want things to be more open. And security teams, want nothing to talk. Everything's, least privilege. And bringing these two together and reconciling this can be a challenge. So what I've done for this part is I went ahead and pre-staged some networks in AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. And we're going to connect these networks in. So think of this as like Brownfield. And that's another thing in the enterprise, when you deploy new solutions, it's hard to bring Brownfield along with you. It's very difficult. A lot of times it ends up being half-baked, or you can't follow through all the way. It's just a lot of things, a lot of tools, a lot of new, and a lot of change. So how do you bring Brownfield in with you and integrate? So for this part, I have the infrastructure as code hosted in source control. And this version's TF there at the bottom. This is going to use Terraform Cloud as a remote backend. And we're going to use GitHub Actions as our delivery mechanism that's going to operate on a trigger. And then it's going to deploy our infrastructure to Alkira. And as I look at this, I think, wow, I kind of overcomplicated this for a live demo, but the thing is, like, this is how I see customers work. And as a customer myself for a long time, this is what we were driving to get to. So, this is what we're going to use. So that was Brownfield. You also have Greenfield, which is a lot easier, all things considered. But one of the things that happens is, cloud takes off, this digital transformation thing happens. And then a lot of, it gets teams excited, or teams like wanting to experiment. And, you have to regulate, you have compliance, you have all these things that you need to control. So a lot of times what I would see is we'd have like an enterprise architecture organization that would sort of vet things as they come through. They'd have like an intake process, or this is sort of transitioning to like a cloud platform, cloud center of excellence, where you build consistent ways of doing things, and you build automation to make sure that you're almost like defining your compliance before it gets into production, basically, like in your code. You don't want the bad things to actually get in at all, or, bad practices, or, malaligned, architectures. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and do it locally with Terraform on my workstation. And then I'm going to use a Terraform module, because this is what I see a lot. Like, a lot of organizations are building that into their Terraform. They want to build things in modules, repeated, environments. And then they want to actually publish those. So infrastructure teams or enterprise architecture teams will write them, and then they publish them to a registry to make it usable by application teams. So we'll go ahead and deploy Greenfield. And, connecting all these things, it's great that they can talk, awesome. But you got to have checks and balances. You want to be able to have that policy in the infrastructure as code as well. So starting from the left, I want to make sure that that core SD-WAN can reach the cloud networks. And that traffic for this demo specifically, I'm going to use 2 different firewall vendors. And I'm going to say, okay, anything from like an on-premises site has got to go through a checkpoint firewall before it goes to cloud. But anything like in the cloud that's going cross cloud or whatever, just in the cloud exclusively, it'll go through Fortinet. And I'm just doing that to demonstrate traffic steering capability with policy. And then the partners, we connected those partners. They're going to help us with that digital transformation. They're going to help us get things going. So first of all, we want it to be least privileged. We don't want them talking to everything, but they do need to talk to that migration VNet or that Azure like landing zone. So that's what we want them to talk to, and that's it. They're going to help us move along. So we have this policy to make sure that that's the only thing that they can reach. And then prod and non-prod cloud networks, I'm just going to say, okay, let's just let all that talk with an open policy. It doesn't have to go through a firewall, and make it easy. And then internet will go through a next-gen firewall. It'll go through a Fortinet. So first things first, I'm going to deploy that CXP. And I'm just going to use US East for this because it's, I live in the East. Okay. Now, I'm starting with a blank slate. Like I have nothing configured at all. And like I said, for these, this baseline, like if I look at like this segmentation, for instance, like with the Terraform provider, everything we can do in the UI, again, we can do, there's parity between the provider, the API, and all the other ways you can interact with our platform. So I'm just defining these groups in a list. We're going to deploy them, keep it simple. And then I'll connect sites and also the services, the firewalls as well. I'm going to go ahead and run this. Again, I'm running Terraform locally on my workstation just to, give it a little variety as we go through each one of these phases. And then as soon as this finishes, I'm just going to pop over and just make sure that everything we wanted to configure got configured. That's quick.
What is it using for authentication? You just get a token from the UI or something?
Yeah, so we actually, all the same, so this is where, that's a good question. So if you use a service principal with Azure, you'd use the same service principal to connect the VNet. So if you already have a pipeline set up, you can almost add just like another stage, like you provision VNet, connect VNet in the same way. So there we go. We have these SD-WAN fabric, and then these 2 partners. And then in the middle, we have this checkpoint and this Fortinet. And then I added an internet exit here for the East region. Now, the next part is, all the DevOps stuff is happening. We're going to look at pipelines and, we have to adapt to that way of doing things. So I'm going to go ahead and I just staged a change in my main file. I'm just going to go ahead and commit it to source control. And I'm going to push that. Now I've got 2 branches set up. I have a develop branch is like an integration branch, and then I have main, which would, match production under normal circumstances. So once I go in here, I have this YAML file in my Git repo, which consists of my pipeline. So it's going to do some some checks and balances first before it does the provisioning, or before it merges to code rather. So we're gonna go ahead and open up a pull request there. Okay, so I have new changes. Just gonna go ahead and create that. So as I create it, before I do the actual merge, it's gonna go through and do these checks, check white space, check formatting. It's gonna initialize all the things I'm working with to make sure everything initializes fine. And then it's gonna go through and actually run the plan completely. And it's gonna do all this before we actually, say, okay, let's provision. That way we can catch any of the low-hanging fruit, anything that might be problematic for us. And while this is running real quick, while that's running, in Terraform Cloud, I basically set up a workspace. And workspaces are essentially just separate state files. Like in the real world, you might have a workspace for like dev networking, QA networking, prod networking. Organizations tend to do it different, but you need to look at it in terms of, okay, like a state file is almost like fault domain in a sense.
Just on the automation side, do you have repositories, templates, lots of default content to help customers get up and running quickly?
Yeah, I do a lot of that. Yeah, we have a lot on our GitHub as far as examples, modules, pre-canned modules, different things to try out,
Is there any wider community activity, with customers contributing to some kind of central repository?
We actually had a customer recently do open up a pull request and have code committed a few weeks ago. But yeah, we're not like, AWS that had, to that scale, but yeah.
But you know yourself, even snippets can be enough to get up and running and get some momentum.
For sure. So here we see that it passed these, formatting and styling things like this low-hanging fruit's good. So I'm going to go ahead and merge that. And it's really going to do a lot of the same stuff again in a sense, but it's going to take that last step of provisioning everything.
Have you seen anyone add something like policy checking to the process using one of the various policy engines that are out there? Is there anything that Alkira supports in that regard?
With the CICD stuff, if a customer is using that stuff already, then this is just part of that process. So all I've tested a lot of that stuff out myself just to make sure everything's working, and some of the like Circle CI, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, like the CI/CD platforms work like you'd expect them to. Like if you're using like AWS or Azure, but yeah, the security tooling, sort of like Manon covered, like all the stuff we're deployed in the cloud providers. So a lot of that, the checks that these tools do, covers a lot of the stuff that we would deploy as well.
Right.
Let's go over to Terraform Cloud real quick. So there's all of our cloud, our brownfield networks. I'm just going to go back and for Greenfield, let's say this is a company, they operate in the US and they have a team that's out west and they're doing something with Oracle Cloud. Why not? So I'm going to go ahead and add another CXP for West. There we go. And again, this one's going to be using a Terraform module. So whereas before we just pulled in a bunch of networks that already existed, this is actually going to go in and create the VCN. And if you're not familiar with Oracle, that's Virtual Cloud Network, just like AWS has VPC. So I have, here's my file. I'm going to create that dev, QA, and prod network. And I'm just putting in these values, the compartment, the region, the CIDR, the name, and then all the Alkira attributes that I want to apply, like the segmentation and the credential names. And modules are basically a really good way, like they're loosely, if you take like really tightly coupled components, like if you have networking, you got a VPC, you got subnets, you got route tables. Okay, you can create a module out of those things. You know, or if you have an Alkira connector in that workflow, you have the Alkira connector and you also have your, maybe some IPAM things in there as well. So that way, like if you can publish this to a development team, they don't have to worry about picking stuff that traditionally can get us in trouble and, you know, have overlap or, you know, just design inconsistency.
Does
There we
Alkira
go.
have modules published in the registry for some of the common stuff?
Yeah. Just more so like the most, I'd say like the top 4 most common use cases that we see. And adding and updating them all the time. So we're going to go ahead and apply that. There we go. There we go. There's our 3 networks for OCI, West Region. And we had those talking points of like the intent, like what we want to talk and not talk. You know, this is going to match our, you know, business compliance requirements. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure all these policies are lined up correctly. So that first thing I talked about, you know, we want to keep these partners and, you know, off in their own little, you know, area over here. We don't want them to be able to talk to everything. So we can visualize that. So those 2 partner connections, no talking to anything else, off on their own. And then we had the prod to internet scenario. So like in the cloud, things that were in the cloud, we're going to go through Fortinet. So our prod networks across both regions actually are going to come back to that Fortinet and go out of the internet. And I mean, normally like in a best case scenario, of course, you're going to deploy the Fortinet in West as well and, you know, have internet there as well. So it wouldn't travel back. And then prod to non-prod. So we, you know, said, okay, everything can talk, you know, doesn't have to go through a firewall. And then SD-WAN to multi-cloud. So our SD-WAN fabric can talk to every single cloud network that we have created. And, oh yeah, the partner to migration. So that was a key point too. So the partners have to be able to access that migration VNet, but that traffic has to go through that checkpoint firewall as well. So that they're limited to that access only. And that migration VNet also is cut off from everything else. And the reason for that is a lot of times the environment that you're going to build for like a lift and shift initiative is going to be like very different than completely cloud native and Greenfield. So a lot of times an organization will keep those sort of separated.